So for the first lesson, the teaching tools I used were standards that align with the formative assessment, hands-on activity, and inquiry-based learning, which included data collection and analysis. And for this lesson, the students were going to be doing a lab assignment with a static charge on a strip of plastic and pulling it between their fingers. For the second lesson, for the standard, the teaching tools I used were hands-on activity and differentiation by product. And for this lesson, the students were looking at the periodic table, and they were just looking at the first 20 elements. And then for the assessment, they were doing a matching activity with a group of people, and they all had 5 different elements that they were working with. For the third lesson, for the first standard, I used a hands-on activity and digital learning resources. And for this lesson, the students were still focusing on the first 20 elements, and they were looking at a diagram. And for the assessment, the students were to complete their activity sheets from the prior class, and they were looking at patterns and columns on the periodic table. And then they were comparing how the elements react chemically and relate to their location on the periodic table by also looking at a variety of videos. For the last lesson of this unit, I used the standards aligned with formative assessment and discussion-based learning. The students were introduced to Lewis dot diagrams, and for the assessment, they were understanding the important role of attraction of opposite charges. And I was showing them how atoms are bonded together. For the second standard, I used standards aligned with the formative assessment and digital learning resources. And for this lesson, the students were learning about how the nuclei of atoms can change in fission and fusion reactions. For the assessment, they were going to complete a series of review questions over what was covered in class. And during this lesson, they were presented a PowerPoint, filled out a graphic organizer, and viewed a website that helped them understand the content. For the second lesson of this, the students were doing a hands-on assessment which used digital resources for instruction. And for this activity, the students were watching a video and using a variety of resources to complete a map comparing and contrasting fusion, fission, and radioactive decay. For the third lesson of this unit, or for this standard, the students were using digital resources for instruction and also a hands-on activity. And for this lesson, the students were first reviewing over what was covered in the previous lesson, and then they were working with the sun's energy and how it produces nuclear fusion. And they were also involved with a assessment that allowed them to choose however many points they wanted from a rubric, and they were asked to build a diagram or do other activities such as building a diagram and meeting the point requirement on the rubric. For the last lesson for this standard, I used inquiry learning, which involved data collection and analysis and differentiation by product. And for this lesson, the students were going to gather information from various online resources, and they were going to make create a mini position paper about the scientific and technological pros and cons to be considered when thinking of these two processes as meeting future energy needs. For the third standard, first lesson, I used standard-aligned formative assessment and inquiry learning, which included collecting data and analyzation. And students were asked to analyze pieces of rationale for why the Earth is round, and they'll also get an introductory glimpse into the major zones of the Earth. Lesson 2 for the third standard. I used discussion-based learning in a hands-on activity, and during this lesson the students were going to explore latitude and longitude in a hands-on way before diving into applying their newfound knowledge with a map of the world and of New York State. And for the assessment, the students were going to complete a series of worksheets in order to understand latitude and longitude, as well as an exit ticket that would have had 2 questions on it. For the third lesson, I used self-assessment and differentiation by process. And for this lesson, the students were able to explain how solar radiation interacts with gases in the atmosphere to impact Earth's climate, as demonstrated by taking notes, performing computer activities, and watching a video. And for the assessment, the teacher will discuss radiation, and then the students will be involved with a variety of activities that will engage them with their topic. The students will decide their own grades on the experiments that take place, which will involve them to write a lab report. The last lesson for this standard, students, I use differentiation by content and digital learning resources. And for the summary of this lesson, smog is a mixture of nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds that combine with sunlight to form ozone. And for the assessment, the students will be able to define smog and discuss its impact on humans, as demonstrated through class discussion, watching a video, performing a reading, and answering questions. For the last standard, first lesson, I used differentiation by product with a hands-on activity. And during this lesson, students will research the topic of stars and find enough information to describe them, as well as draw a diagram of them. And for the assessment, the students will draw a diagram for the 3 different types of stars, so each one could look different, and it is a hands-on activity with the students drawing their own diagrams. Second lesson, I used discussion-based learning and digital learning resources. And for this lesson, the students will read a passage and give a description of what is occurring during each stage in a star's life cycle. This will be followed by practice and review questions. And for the assessment, the students will read a passage and answer a series of questions afterwards, which would involve discussion between the class. So that's discussion-based learning, and then they were allowed to use websites, which gets the digital learning resources. Third lesson, I used a hands-on activity and inquiry-based learning, including data collection and analysis. And for this lesson, the students explore the relationships between color, luminosity, and temperature of a star using the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. And for the assessment, this was an activity with which the students are involved with the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, and it was a hands-on activity that required them to use text and information, and also allowing them to draw the diagram on how they view it. And then it also required that they collect data and analyze the data that they collected. The last lesson for the last standard, I used differentiation by product and a standard aligned formative assessment. And for this lesson, each student will be assigned a different stage of a star's life cycle, and they'll have to create a project that depicts that stage. And that project would be up to them, whether it be a poster, a 3D diagram, or a trifold. So that's where you get the differentiation of a product. And then obviously the formative assessment aligns up with the standard. So that's all I have for you. Thank you.